Welcome back to Trailblazing Women Veterans, a podcast series that shares the stories of women veterans and their contributions to American military history. We are in our third episode, so if you haven't had an opportunity, go ahead and check out episodes 1 and 2 as we are moving forward. I am your host, Ashley Gorbolja, one of the original Tango Alpha Lima podcast hosts, and I am joined today with Jeff Stouffer, Media and Communications Division Director at the National Headquarters in Indianapolis.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Ashley, one of my favorite women veterans who I've worked with for many years. And I remember so many great memories from when you were at Akron and you were Student Veterans of America and all of our time. I'll never forget our time together at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, our 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier just a couple of years ago. And what a moment that was. So in honor of Women's History Month this March, we've designated the middle of each week as Military Women Wednesday. That's the day we're going to bring you remarkable stories of service, sacrifice, and strength that span our nation's history. I want you to make sure to subscribe to our podcast and newsletter at legion.org/Tango Alpha Lima so you don't miss a single episode.
All right, well, let's get started. So welcome to this episode. Today, we're going to be honoring Colonel Allison Black, otherwise known as the Angel of Death, for her historic role as the first AC-130H Spectre navigator to open fire on enemy targets in combat. Colonel Black's story exemplifies the courage and resilience of women in military, especially in combat roles.
You know, I think that this was the ultimate threshold through which the women veteran experience passed, and that was the global war on terrorism. As the 21st century dawned, changes in culture, changes in how we fight and prosecute war, opened up opportunities for women in all facets of military operations. And by then, you know, we see a lot of opening and opportunity happening in assumption of leadership positions, emergence of female rangers and even Navy SEALs, and pivotal roles in intelligence and cyber warfare, counterterrorism attack efforts, you know, cultural advisors and liaisons, bringing gaps with local populations, and of course their long-term. I mean, this is the MOS that they've had since the Revolution: medical and medical personnel, nursing, providing crucial care, providing combat medicine, saving lives on the front lines, and of course, as we many of us know, the rate of survival on the front from a battle wound in Iraq or Afghanistan was astronomically higher than any other war zone. So those men and women who served in those MOSs, I mean, they changed warfare. Female aviators flew combat missions and they operated drones. They contributed to reconnaissance and strike capabilities, and that is where the story of Colonel Allison Black begins to take shape at a time when women in the U.S. military service had truly and finally begun a transformation. And I call that transformation from Angels of Mercy, as we learned about with Angels of Anzio, who were the nurses who worked in Italy during World War II, to Angels of Death.
All right. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Angels of the Battlefield back at Civil War. I'm just saying, Clara Barton, shout out.
There were angels of Baton, and so they used the term angels, and true to those who were in combat and were wounded and had these amazing nurses. Vietnam had amazing combat nurses. One of them was a good friend of mine. They just absolutely saved lives and cared for people while under fire in the worst possible conditions.
I couldn't agree more. I like the choice of words here. Angels of Mercy to Angels of Death. So more about the Angels of Death. Allison Black enlisted in the U.S. Air Force at 18 in 1992. Following family tradition of military service, she rose through the ranks, earning a bachelor's degree and completing officer training school at Maxwell Air Force Base. After training as an instructor, she became a gunship navigator at Hurlburt Field in Florida.
Right. So in November of 2001, the future Colonel Black, who was then a first lieutenant, flew on one of the earliest U.S. combat missions over northern Afghanistan after 9/11, and she was supporting the Northern Alliance's efforts to regain control from the Taliban. You know, her crew used the AC-130's firepower in devastating effect. They put 440 millimeter rounds and 105 millimeter rounds into enemy positions. Now, there's a story that goes with this, and this story I heard for the first time, and this is why I wanted to make sure that Colonel Black was part of our Historic Women series. This came from the Washington Conference, American Legion Washington Conference in 2011, and she was a speaker, and I was utterly mesmerized by her story. You know, she had been assigned to the 16th Operations Squadron at Hurlburt, but she was deployed into Uzbekistan, and one night, middle of a November night, she and her crew, the rubble of the Twin Towers was still smoldering in New York City in November of 2001, and they took off to go find and eliminate Taliban strongholds in northern Afghanistan. And at that time, she had all she had really. It was not today's Air Force. At that time, she had a call sign, a radio frequency, longitude and latitude, and go get them. Okay, well, she had one other asset, and that was, and I've talked to some veterans about this, veterans of Afghanistan. They had high-powered laser pointers to identify targets before they were fire upon them. So at the Washington conference in 2011, she told us the story that, that the AC-130 is basically designed to put bullets where bombs can't go. And they certainly did that with this barrage of 40 millimeter, 105 millimeter rounds. But it wasn't those rounds and that firing that really caught the attention of a very famous Northern Alliance general who was working on the ground. It was when he was fielding information from the air. His question was, that a woman up there? And he was very baffled by all this. And then the next thing he was wondering is, and one other thing, is that a death ray? That was his question. Was it a death ray? Well, and of course the airman and Colonel Black, wasn't a colonel then, she was a lieutenant, said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, it is a death ray. So it really wasn't a death ray. It was just a laser pointer, but they did rain death on the enemy at that point. And he said something about this to the Taliban. The Taliban was like, didn't understand what the heck was happening. And he said, and he was quoted as saying, the angel of death is raining destruction, so surrender now. The insurgents immediately surrendered, and the famous Northern Alliance general, it was General Dostum, we will remember him from the horse soldiers fame, who used this event as a teachable moment for Afghan women. And there's some ceremony later where he said, look what America allows their women to do. One day our country will have similar freedoms.
So moving.
Yeah,
That's
it really
powerful.
But yeah, I just think it's so funny. But she was, and frankly, Colonel Black was a very locked in, from enlisted to officer to colonel, and to combat pilot. She was everything. Every interview I've ever read with her, everything I've ever heard about her, she was a woman who just simply was doing her job. It wasn't, gender was the furthest thing from her thoughts. Mission was on her mind, and that's how she operated. It was absolutely putting the mission first, and putting her job first in the Air Force was, I think, her calling card.
It's incredible. I just have to take a moment and just like bask in the awe of Allison Black. And it's wow, okay. Refocus. I can't help but wonder, but you got to assume Colonel Black's mission marked the beginning of the fall of the Taliban in northern Afghanistan, and it earned her the Air Force Combat Action Medal, if I'm not mistaken. Her actions paved the way for other women to serve in combat roles and highlighted women's important contributions to the military.
She was historic in getting the Air Force Combat Action Medal, the first woman, I think, to do that in that way. And her after that mission, that early mission, she continued to serve in a variety of roles and ultimately assumed command of the first Special Operations Wing at Hurlburt Field, which was interesting because she trains in this capacity there. She flies combat missions. She just retired in January of this year after 32 years of service, and she left an amazing legacy of of that I think is an inspiration for all kinds of future women of the military. And I would also want to begin to remind people that her actions came, let's see, I think 14 years before women were quote unquote officially permitted to serve in combat roles. So these pioneers, they were actually performing combat duties before the DoD had a policy allowing it. And I think that's what makes the global war on terrorism so different from previous conflicts, is that when you're in Iraq or Afghanistan, very much like the women who are on the beach at Anzio, who isn't in combat, and the women who served in the Vietnam War. But I'll leave it at that.
It's a great segue thinking about the new era of warfare for the global war on terrorism, folks, because in this series, we're really trying to piece back these different eras and how there's some overlap and there's consistency. So as we, in the present day, talk about policy and equality in these roles and combat, women have always been an all volunteer in US military eras of service. So it's really hard to say, oh, well, show me examples. Well, this podcast is an entire example for anyone who's still in doubt. I digress, but let's take a let's peel it back just a little bit. So we're up to a point where from the end of World War II until the time of Allison Black joined the military is known as the Cold War era. During this period of worldwide geopolitical tensions, America experienced social and political changes, not the least of which was the women's liberation movement as a result of policies that began to change women in increasingly held administrative, technical, medical positions within the military, setting the stage for further inclusion.
Yeah, the Korean War again was another step in that direction, with women who did primarily serve in traditional support roles such as nursing and clerical positions, but they provided crucial medical and administrative support during the conflict. But it was in the theater of combat. They were serving in combat and they were upholding their commitments.
Absolutely. Anna Mae Hayes comes to mind. She was the first woman in the U.S. military to attain a rank of brigadier general during the Korean War. She served as a nurse and later became the chief of the Army Nurses Corps, making significant contributions to military nursing in this time frame.
Yeah, and Eileen Collins, although she was more widely recognized for her achievements in space exploration, later she began her military career as a U.S. Air Force officer during the Korean War era, and she went on to become the first female space shuttle pilot and commander.
Captain Della H. Raney, another interesting individual, was a nurse during the Korean War and served in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. She received the Bronze Star for her dedication and contributions to the medical care of wounded soldiers.
Colonel Ruth A. Lucas was the first African American woman to achieve the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army. She served during the Korean War and continued her military career, and she broke down barriers for women and minorities both serving in the U.S. Armed Forces.
So moving from the Korean War to Vietnam War, women have served nurses, clerks, support staff. They did so during the Vietnam War, their vital roles. Medical care, administrative support demonstrated their dedication to troops in periods marked by significant social change and protests against war. In previous episode, we mentioned how in Civil War time, photography and journalism of that time were a critical point. This is also one of those turning points, specifically at the home front in the US, and thoughts and views on war and otherwise going against the a united front war effort. This was a very decisive war.
Yeah, they had to, they enlisted and went to war against a heck of a lot of peer pressure from their own generation. Their own generation were protesting the very war that they were going off to fight and die in. I think that the Vietnam War is that story, and I also think the story of harkening back to that, those who served in the Vietnam War, who enlisted to serve in the Vietnam War, as well as those who were drafted and went and fought, so valiantly and so honorably during that war, kind of it harkens to the fact that there was a time when women literally had to force their way into the military, as we talked about with the Civil War and the Revolution, that they had to actually disguise themselves in order to get the opportunity to serve their country in uniform, to risk their lives for their country. And I think that that's just such an extraordinary characteristic of these people that we're talking about in this show. um, Mary Therese Klinker, I'm going to start that over. Mary Therese Klinker was a U.S. Air Force flight nurse who tragically lost her life in the crash of the C-5A Galaxy aircraft during the Vietnam War's Operation Baby Lift. Her dedication to providing medical care to the infants and children in need of adoption is always remembered with honor.
You have Admiral Marcela J Harris, served in the U.S. Navy and later became the first woman to command a U.S. Navy ship. Although her military career extended beyond the Vietnam War, her achievements paved the way for women in naval leadership.
Diane Carlson Evans, who is a dear friend of mine. I've just spent Veterans Day with her last fall on the National Mall, where she was the keynote speaker on the 30th anniversary of the dedication to the Vietnam Women's Memorial. She was a combat nurse in Vietnam and later became just an incredible inspiration for women veterans, not only of her era, but in the future. And I think that's one of the things that really came to light when I was in Washington for the 30-year anniversary and the dedication ceremonies, the stories that were told from women nurses, but not only women nurses of the Vietnam era, and not just nurses, but all MOSs, all the way up to active duty military women who were there to talk about, quote, like you said, standing on the shoulders of giants. That this experience, Diane Carlson Evans is one of those giants, and the decade-long battle that she put out to get a women's memorial on the National Mall is nothing less than extraordinary, and what an inspiration it has been.
Having had an opportunity to meet Diane myself, an incredible individual. I know she received I can't remember which convention, but she ended up getting was it a medal?
It's
Forgive me.
the Distinguished Service Medal from the American Legion, which is our highest honor as an organization. So she has well, the American Legion's very proud of Diane Carlson Evans, and very proud that it stood stoutly by her throughout her decade-long battle to get that women's memorial placed on the National Mall near the wall. Diane said very famously, she said that wall would be about 6 feet higher if not for the nurses who served in theater. There's about 10,500 Vietnam War combat nurses who served in theater, and then there's about 265,000 other women who served all over the planet during the Vietnam War in all kinds of capacities that were not necessarily in combat, but everybody was in support of what we were trying to achieve in Vietnam.
Yeah, it just absolutely incredible. So another person that comes to mind, Major General Marcela J Harris. She became the first female aircraft maintenance officer within this time range. She was Air Force first female director of maintenance and one of the first female air officers commanding the Air Force Academy. Harris retired a major general, holding the distinction of being the highest ranking African American woman in the Department of Defense and the highest ranking female officer in the Air Force. Her groundbreaking achievements and leadership continue to inspire generations of women and African Americans in military and beyond. She's another one that stood out, who just wow. I mean, when you get your start at a certain time period, and then what these folks go on to do is incredible.
Also, as a reminder that every military occupational specialty and duty station is vital in the prosecution of wartime service and non-wartime and peacetime service too. But the maintenance, I mean, yeah, it is vital to the functioning of an effective military. You can check out our show notes and learn more about Colonel Black. She is a figure I think worth reading about. We're going to have links in our information about her career and several articles, including one about her address to the American Legion in 2011, which I attended and was so moved by what she had to say.
Colonel Black's story inspires us to break barriers and overcome challenges. It shows that with dedication, courage, and anything is possible. It's a I can, I will watch me moment if I ever saw one. Her legacy continues to serve and remind us that women have had vital roles in our military throughout history, and an all volunteer force, baby. All. So I got a plug for my gals out there. But we've been raising our right hand for a real long time and breaking barriers. And we've only hit a very, very small sliver of these amazing women throughout these few decades we've discussed today. But we appreciate you and thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share this podcast to honor the trailblazers who have shaped history. And if you have a story to share, post it on your favorite social media platform, tag the American Legion, and use the hashtag Military Women Wednesday. We'll see you next week with more stories of outstanding women as we continue to celebrate Women's History Month.